and see if we're recording, and we are recording. And so I'll bring up the slides for, or let's see, no, I have to bring them up this way, don't I? Okay, so we'll talk for a short while here about Subway, Subway's venture into China. And let me just check and make sure that I'm doing everything right here, because sometimes I forget to push a button. The problem with Moodle is that sometimes it doesn't show you the controls. And so I don't know whether I've got it right or not. Well, let's just hope I do, because the Zoom is not showing me the controls. Okay, so we hope we're sharing. All right, so this mini case on Subway is at the end of chapter 15, which is this week's chapter. And you're asked to answer a question, number 5. But at the very end of the last slide, I'm going to ask you another question. So try to stay awake until we get to the last slide. Either that or wake up when we get there. But also read this Wikipedia article on Subway that I put on the Moodle shell. You don't have to read it for all the detail in it, but just the general ideas, and you'll get a much different perspective on Subway. There's another article, if you just go on to, oh boy, the feature on your computer that does search. I've got a mental block on it, but if you just go take a look at the other articles that come up when you search for Subway, you will find an article that deals with the differences that Subway has had with its franchisees, and how many of the franchisees have been pulled by Subway. And apparently, when Subway writes its franchise agreements, the agreements give Subway quite a lot of latitude. And there's a suggestion in, I believe, the Wikipedia article that Wikipedia chooses franchisees that are perhaps non-Americans who don't read or can't read contracts really well. But Subway has just run roughshod over these people. There have been lawsuits, but most of them have gone Subway's in Subway's favor. Not all, but generally Subway's come out on top of these disputes. Subway is not publicly owned. You can't buy stock in it. So Subway does not disclose its financial results the way other fast food companies do, for instance. So the sales in the United States apparently are about $10 billion, and sales outside the US are about $7 billion. So it's a big company. Entering China, very difficult for the master franchisor, and I should master franchisee rather. James Bryant. Um, I don't know whether you guys have looked at my background or remember it, but I used to be director of corporate planning for Holiday Inn. So I am pretty familiar with franchising, including franchising in other countries as well as this one. When we go into another country, it's or even a large region, if a company is just getting started, it sometimes is true that a master franchisee will be appointed. A master franchise is given the opportunity and the obligation to set up other franchises within that region. And in this case, the master franchisee was authorized to award franchises in China. In the article, it's explained that he got half of the franchise fee, and I think something like 3/8 of the monthly franchise fees. So I think eventually Mr. Bryant did pretty well. Today, but there were real difficulties to get to that point. Today, there are about 600 stores in China, but that's a lot less than the other fast food companies that have entered China. Um, Again, I'm having trouble remembering proper nouns here today. Remember Starbucks? Starbucks eventually got 3,000 stores opened in China, right? Now, Starbucks' approach to opening stores in China was a lot different than franchising. It opened them all, right, itself. Sometimes got partners, but and remember Schultz sort of spearheaded that effort himself. So Subway's approach is much different than Starbucks was, and Starbucks ended up with a lot more stores. And these stores, in terms of their fixed assets, their requirement for equipment, store rentals, store space rental, and so forth, are probably pretty similar. The problem, a big problem that Subway had in China was that the concept of a sub sandwich was completely foreign to the Chinese. And so was the store, the Subway store. So when you read the case, you read that the people who saw the Subway store sat outside the store and looked in the window and watched how people, customers would go in and order sandwiches because they are not used to cold sandwiches, and they're not used to ordering a la carte by ordering the various kinds of bread or sauce or meat that goes in the sandwich. They weren't comfortable touching the food. That's not the way people that went into a restaurant would consume their food. They didn't touch it like the way you hold a sandwich. So the people were uncomfortable doing that. And so there was a lot of educating, not least of which, of course, was educating entrepreneurs who wanted to have their own business, but again, did not know exactly what a Subway or Subway type sandwich is, let alone how to assemble one or operate a Subway store. So a totally new concept. But the market is big, it's worth the trouble. In the article, it mentions that there are about 1.3 billion people in China. And of course, that was when the article was written. Today, it's about 1.4 billion. So I put the correct number there. And it's also mentioned in the article that about a quarter of the population earns at least $10,000 per capita. What is not mentioned is that in China, families tend to live in the same house, and multiple family members may usually have jobs. So the median family income, you may recall from another chapter, can be significantly larger than the per capita income, which makes it easier for people to buy this product. Nevertheless, at $5 per sandwich, for Chinese, that's a lot of money. And of course, today, when you read the article in Wikipedia, you will find that the $5 sub no longer exists because the franchisees couldn't afford to sell it for that. In China, the good news is that disposable income is rising. Every day, more people can afford to buy Subway sandwiches. And the more good news is the urban population is rising. And the pace of life in Chinese cities is quickening. So it's more convenient, more attractive for people to eat their meals away from home, the way folks do in this country. So as that trend goes on, the growth rate of Subway's business accelerates. Even more favorable is the psychology, the social psychology of Chinese people. A large number, a large proportion want to have their own business. They're very self-motivated, self-sufficient. So they are potential entrepreneurs. They'll want to have their own business. Another good part, of course, is that China is a much different market than the US. And so taking advantage of the franchisees' knowledge of the local market is a real advantage for anybody who franchises. And just like in the United States, regions of China have different markets. Some regions are high tech, some regions are manufacturing, some regions are agricultural, some regions are hot and humid like they are here. Other regions are cold and rainy. The local market conditions can make a big difference. Normally in the United States, the franchisee pays the franchise fee of about $15,000. In China, it was $10,000, and also gets financing to buy all of the equipment that goes into the store. But most of the folks in China can't afford that kind of investment. So the master franchisee that we discussed earlier ended up financing all of that. and had to incur costs that the franchisees typically bear. So he purchased the equipment that would go into a franchise store, and the people would pay and making time payments until they were doing well enough that they could buy the equipment or make the remaining payments themselves. But this guy was a financier for the franchisees in China, very different from the US and the established market. As I mentioned earlier, the market's growing rapidly, so most of these arrangements worked out okay. And another good part, according to the article at the back of your book, the back of the chapter, a couple of conveniences of the franchising arrangement in China are that the contract permits the company to maintain brand consistency. The folks who have franchises agree contractually to operate their stores according to standard practices. And another benefit is that since the franchisee owns the store, it's not a question of the foreign company, Subway, going into China and owning these stores. And so a lot of the legal constraints on foreign ownership were circumvented. Okay, now you can see that the print is a lot smaller on this slide. This is a list in your article, or it's a list of items in the article that discuss the challenges, the difficulties of entering China as a franchisor. Again, what I mentioned earlier is that the franchise concept was entirely new to everyone. The franchisee, the so-called entrepreneur, the folks who make the laws in China regarding franchising are very incomplete, uncertain. The protection of that provided in the contract, protection of the trademark and the brand are all uncertain, probably still uncertain today. Customers didn't understand franchising, creditors didn't, banks didn't. So it was a real startup for this guy that took on the challenge. The cost of starting, as I mentioned earlier, had to be borne by the master franchise. Had to buy the equipment and lease it to the franchisees till they could buy it. Also paid costs of remodeling the store so that it was a Subway. Normally, in mature economies, the franchisee pays that. And all of these startup costs for a single store could be pretty substantial. A number in the article is $100,000. I think it's important to recognize that supplier networks, if you're talking about a system of franchises throughout the country, then you need a national supplier network. And of course, in the US, they're already set up, but there is no such thing in China. At least there wasn't back then when it was started, and I imagine they're still immature. But there are serious competitors: Kentucky Fried, McDonald's, Pizza Hut. By the way, Kentucky Fried and Pizza Hut are part of the same company called Yum Foods. But there are big competitors there with a lot more stores than Subway has. And consequently, the big cities already were pretty saturated. And so um, I did this by dictation, and it looks like uh, the system heard me say a different word. And so stores were moving to second tier cities. And although that's sounds like moving to small towns and so forth, I remember going to smaller cities in China where the population was only 5 billion, about the size of New York. And uh, Xi'an, the original capital of China, today has a population, I think, of about 4.5 billion, and it's considered a small city. So uh, moving to second tier cities isn't that much of a come down. It just means that the great big cities like Shanghai and um, Beijing are getting very, very full of fast food operations. So another problem that I mentioned earlier is that the typical Chinese person doesn't enjoy an income that enables them to afford buying a meal at Subways. Subway is considered to be a restaurant, a little better place. But the customers of Subways tend to be managers, higher paid technicians, foreign folks from foreign countries that make enough money that they can afford to go to Subways for lunch or dinner. But the typical Chinese can't afford a Subway, although, as I mentioned earlier, because of the family unit, which can, if 3 people are earning the average income of $10,000, that's a $30,000 family. So now, it's possible that they can afford to get a Subway, but it's Subway is not a bargain. It's not an affordable meal as it is here. The franchise fee of $10,000 was equivalent to about 2 years average salary, according to the article at the back of the chapter. So very often people would scrape up the money by getting it from family members and collecting that $10,000. But the article mentioned that banks were becoming more receptive of franchising because it was obviously a form of business that was working and growing. So getting bank financing was not easy, but it was not as difficult as it had been in the past. And another problem was real estate. In these big cities, the real estate is pretty well all filled with buildings, and those buildings have occupants, stores, and so forth that are pretty well saturated the real estate market. So the price of real estate is pretty expensive in the big Chinese cities. And to make matters worse, much of Chinese real estate is owned by the Chinese government. So there is another, I can see another one of the those little typos that came from my digital voice system. Chinese law restricts repatriation of profits. So if the profit is made in China and you want to use those profits to reinvest in a Chinese business, that's just fine. But if you want to take that profit from the Subway master franchise and take those profits back to the United States, that could be a problem. So you can see from this list that this guy that built the master franchise in China really had his hands full. It was not an easy thing to do. Okay, to some other complications. Culturally, Chinese customers prefer hot meals. They traditionally don't have cold meals, such as cold sandwiches. And in fact, because they don't like to touch their food, they reject sandwiches. So if you go back to Ansoff's model, you've got a big product development issue here because you've got to not just develop the product, but you've got to get the culture to accept this product. And apparently there has been some success. After all, they've got 600 stores. Chinese customers also don't feel comfortable selecting all those components for a sandwich. And the reason is that traditionally a hot meal was prepared all together. And if you went to a restaurant to buy a meal, you wouldn't have to tell the folks what you want in that meal. What you order is all prepared. And then what's interesting is how the restaurant prepares it. So the national supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, is undeveloped. So getting the components for those sandwiches, the meats, the vegetables, the sauces, the breads, so forth, it's not as straightforward as it would be in a mature economy. And so now having to move to smaller cities just made all that more complicated. I have looked myself on the internet for financial facts about Subway, and boy, I'll tell you, Subway really keeps it under wraps. So you just don't know what their results are. There are a few phrases in articles that enable you to get some understanding. U.S. sales recently were about 10 billion, international sales about 7 billion. I did not put a bullet here, probably should have, but apparently during the last couple of years, the Subway did not have operating profit. And apparently the profitability of the corporation has been declining for several years. That's partly due to the fact that there is competition from all sorts of sources, including other fast food chains, as well as grocery stores and trucks that deliver lunches, offering fresh sandwiches with fresh materials. So as a result of that, Subway felt that it had to compete based on price. And the profitability of a Subway store went down, and the royalties paid to Subway went down. And apparently, this business model has not been very successful lately. You get none of that in this article at the back of the chapter. So in the chapter, you hear about Subway's success in China. What you don't see is that Subway's business model is under a great deal of stress. So you should see the Wikipedia article for a much different perspective on Subway. And then this last bullet, take a look at the last bullet, please. Should Subway have chosen Howard Schultz's method, right? That's the Starbucks method for growing in China. Schultz was able to put together 3,000 Starbucks stores, essentially the same investment as a Subway, and Subway has gotten 600. So the question is, should Schultz's method of growing Starbucks been chosen? Would that have been a better way for the Subway franchise system to grow? But it wouldn't have been a franchise system, would it? It could have been a joint venture. It could have been some sort of a partnership where the parent company had some of the ownership and the franchisee or the partner had partial ownership. That might have worked pretty well. But somehow it seems like Subway, although it deserves a lot of credit for building 600 stores in a market that did not understand franchising, the potential of China and the large market would seem to suggest that more than 600 stores in that country should be possible, and yet that's about as far as the system has grown. So let me bring this back. And so I'd like you to answer that question, and I'll put it on Moodle. But do you think that the Starbucks approach to growing the franchise system by growing the company itself, keeping that under control? Subway already is a huge company. It's got the financial resources. But maybe the way I'll ask the question is, has Subway's method of growing in China been the most appropriate method? What do you think? Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is try to stop the recording because